going to be kind of technical, so I hope you're interested in neuroscience and abstraction. Anyway, so this talk is about abstraction, truth, and light, in the light in the spiritual sense. And so I'm going to try to use the concept of abstraction to explain what truth is with Jordan Peterson's definition, and then use that to understand light. So the motivation for doing this was really the debate between, the multiple debates between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. I think there were 6 different debates that they had, 2 hours each, and it was all about religion, but it kind of centered around the definition of truth. They kept coming back to it. They tried not to talk about it too much, but it was kind of at the center of everything. So Harris thinks that religion is basically a mind virus, that it's only popular because it has this ability to infect people and cause them to spread it. And so it could have been any random belief, but it happened to be the religions that we have, and so that's what we have. And Peterson, what he believes about religion, he technically doesn't answer the question whether he believes that if God exists, literally, physically, but he believes that a belief in God is the most true belief that people can have because it motivates people to act in the most competent manner humans have ever discovered. So, and then the traditional, the belief of members of the church is that obviously God is real and he physically exists, and so it's actually kind of a mix between their two beliefs, except if Sam Harris were actually believed in God, which is kind of a weird way to put it, but alright, I'll just stick to my notes. So Harris believes that facts about the universe are the concrete truth, whereas Peterson believes that personal direct experience is the concrete reality. I used to think more like Harris, and it's kind of the traditional view that the truth is like this disembodied description of the universe and how things are. But actually, Peterson has the advantage in this debate, because every fact we learn about the universe is developed through personal experience. What we think of as objective statements or statements about the objects in the universe are actually just practical abstractions in our minds that help us live in the world, like a map helps us get somewhere we're trying to go. If it helps us get there, then it's true. And so because it's based on personal experience, it's more fundamental than Harris's definition of truth. So in this talk, I'm going to try to argue for Peterson's definition of truth and explain why the statements about the objective world and objects are just abstractions in our minds, and how that puts other abstractions like numbers and stories into the same category as concrete objects. Once you see the world this way, Peterson will make a lot more sense, and I think you'll appreciate how much truth is packed into the scriptures at all levels, metaphorical and literal. Because I think a lot of the time we get hung up on the literal aspects, like, was the earth actually created in 7 literal days? But how meaningful is that to us? Does that even matter? So I think we have a lot to learn from Peterson's perspective. Okay, so first thing, objects are not as concrete as we are used to thinking. Take a table as an example. The temporal boundaries of when a table became a table and when it became not a table are fuzzy. Because first it was a tree, and then it was cut into logs and then lumber, and it was assembled into a table, and at some point it started to look like a table. And exactly when that is would have been close to completion, but it's a little fuzzy when we would actually call it a table. People would probably disagree on exactly when. And the same thing happens for the future of the table. First it's worn down, and then it gets it deteriorates into its constituent pieces, and the boundary of exactly when it was no longer a table would be different people would say different things about it. And so it's kind of fuzzy temporally, the definition of a table. And the same problem happens spatially. So every object in the universe is influenced by every other object in the universe, electromagnetically and gravitationally. And so where you can draw its actual physical boundaries is kind of arbitrary. And even when you touch objects, that's just electromagnetic force preventing you from going through the table. So, and you're not actually touching the atoms. So it's kind of fuzzy what the exact boundaries of the object are. So I want to argue that objects are actually abstractions created by our minds and projected over matter. And a good example of this is Noam Chomsky's mountain example. So think of a mountain like that. And a lot of people's intuition is that the mountain is just a mountain. Like it's necessarily a mountain. Every part of it is part of the mountain and it can't be anything else. It's like an objective fact about the world. But if the water level rises up to here, then that thing is an island. And that's actually what islands are, right? So the thing itself didn't change, but because something around it changed, now it's something different. And that makes no sense. Or if you pile a bunch of dirt around it, it becomes part of a plateau. So what's actually there? Well, it could be atoms or maybe protons and electrons, whatever level analysis you want. It seems like it can be broken down to even more fundamental pieces. So what you're actually seeing with the mountain is an abstraction created by your mind. And this is literally how the mind is built. So I have a video here from a neuroscientist.
Your light will excite the neuron. And as far as we know so far, it's just a light detector, like the retina. See? You put that bar through it, and it gets excited by light. But they're being a little bit cagey. They're not...
I'll explain what's going on here. This video is what they're showing an animal, okay? And they're monitoring an electron, and the sound you hear, the clicking sound, is the electron, or the neuron firing. And so when the light goes in the square, it fires.
Showing you what's very special about this neuron. But here comes the critical experiment, and I'll be quiet, except notice the orientation changes. And now watch. It fires. Here's the really critical experiment. Watch this. It was firing like a mad Geiger counter before, and here it is back again, when Hubel and Diesel were showing the appropriate orientation.
So that's like the most simple neuron. It doesn't fire for just a simple stimulus. It's actually looking for a pattern. And yeah, it's a pretty low level neuron. Oops. There we go. All right, but there are more sophisticated neurons. There are many layers in the brain, and these ones down here, the neuron we just looked at was just like these. It's looking for edges. So the next layer up, they do the same thing as the lower level neurons, except they're looking for patterns, but rather than patterns of pixels, they're looking for patterns of pixels. So if you look at this right here, it's putting together different edges to make that shape. And then the next layer above that is putting these together to make a face. And that's how facial recognition works, both in the brain and in artificial neural networks. And so that brings me to this one.
The example of the most complex receptive field, or most specific and complex receptive field, I think, in the literature. And this is work by Christoph Koch and his longtime collaborator Ishak Fried at Caltech and at UCLA, recording in a human. This is a human patient, which for medical reasons, neurosurgical reasons, the brain was exposed, and in those patients, it's common to record the electrical activity of neurons in their brain for diagnostic purposes, but also one can add on a brief but important neurophysiological experiment. And this is a human being who was looking at pictures on a computer monitor, and Christoph and Itzhak Fried and collaborators were listening to a neuron. And in their eureka moment, when they were showing, people already knew that there were neurons in the temporal cortex, the what pathway, that saw faces that had been described in species other than humans. But they found, as they were showing a battery of faces, a neuron that just fired for Jennifer Aniston. They noticed it once, and then they said, oh my goodness, let's go back. Let's get a bunch of pictures of Jennifer Aniston and see if the neuron is a neuron that signals this picture of her. But no, it wasn't. It was a neuron that showed that would fire action potentials whenever this human saw a picture of Jennifer Aniston. And even when in later experiments, when the human thought of Jennifer Aniston, this neuron would fire. And that gets into both complex receptive.
That's pretty cool, right? Yeah. So the fact that the person would just think about Jennifer Aniston and it would fire, it makes me think that neuron really is just for Jennifer Aniston, and it's in the part of the brain that recognizes faces, and so that also seems to support that. And so Jennifer Aniston is a real person, but to all of us, she is a neuron. and it's the same with all objects. With every object we recognize, there's a neuron, at least one, in our brain that it encodes for that specific object. And so that's why all objects are abstractions, because a neuron technically is an abstraction, because it's a filter. So here's the definition of abstraction. To abstract means to draw away from. So if you take, this is something Peterson talks about all the time. If you take a pink square, for example, there are many things that you could draw away from it. You could draw a square, you could draw its width or its height, or just the number one, that it is a thing and not other things, or any of those other things. All these are potential abstractions from the pink square. Different abstractions are useful at different times. If you're looking for things to stack on top of each other, you'll see the square. If you're looking for something that will fit between two items, you might only see the width. And if you're counting things, you'll just see the one. So we started out with the square with this example, but how do we create abstractions for objects in real life? So ever since we're born, we've had massive amounts of data fire hosed through our eyes into our brains in video format. Our brains were rewarded for certain interactions with certain objects, and so connections grew to the neurons that fired during that interaction. And one object will appear in many different forms. Now, like computer vision, people talk about this all the time. Like, what a cat looks like from one angle is completely different from what it looks like from another angle. And so it's really complicated to recognize an object. But what we do is we abstract a couple of characteristic or unique images from the video, and then we kind of have a neuron that is triggered by all those distinct images, and then we understand that is that object. And Google did this with an AI. They played a ton of YouTube videos, and on its own it developed a neuron that represented cats. And so this image right here it represents all the connections and all the neurons down to pixels that come down from that one neuron that represents cats. Not any specific cat, but the concept of cat. So that's what the concept of cat looks like. Yeah, so like I said at the beginning, the goal of this was to introduce the idea that things that we can't touch are all patterns can be just as concrete as physical objects. Everything we see is an abstraction, but the more useful an abstraction proves to be, the more the neuronal connections are strengthened and the more subjectively concrete it becomes. So we're more likely to say that's a real thing if we've experienced it more. And then it gets more interesting because they're actually temporal abstractions, so patterns that occur over time. Here's another one from this guy.
So here we have, on the right-hand side, a picture that doesn't look like much yet. But now it looks like something. On the upper right-hand corner is the stimulus, but the rest of the picture is actually roughly 100 neurons, and you can just watch them flash away. Rather than listening to them, you can see them. So, quite literally, it's seeing the visual system see. And as you can probably see, half the neurons fire now, the other half of the neurons fire now. Some of the neurons like stimuli going down and to the left, the other neurons like stimuli going up and to the right. So rather than listening to one at a time, or maybe 10 at a time in modern experiments, we can look at 100 cells at a time, or maybe 1,000.
Yeah. So yeah, it's the same exact physical shape, but the motion is different. And so there are neurons that are sensitive to temporal patterns as well as physical patterns, spatial patterns. And there's this video that's famous from psychology. I'll just play a little part of it. You can just see what's going on with it. I won't even bother maximizing the screen because it's only 30 seconds. Anyway, he gets away. So, yeah, the reason this was famous is because it showed how little information is required for us to attribute personalities to abstract shapes like circles and triangles. So that kind of shows a temporal abstraction in a very distilled example. But there are all kinds of abstractions that span time, or patterns that span time, that we see all over us. Like this is what Jordan Peterson refers to as like the truth that's inside fiction, because it shows a pattern that can be applied to many potential scenarios. It's like a distillation of truth, and that's the benefit of abstractions, is that they can apply to many situations, and so you can share things between people. So this is where we arrive at truth. So there are a lot of potential patterns out there, but how do you know which ones are real or useful? The ones that are the most real will appear the most until they become the most familiar if we're paying attention. The patterns that are real are truths. Knowing these patterns gives us the ability to succeed because they show us how the future will unfold if we act in certain ways, allowing us to choose the future we want. So we recognize the beginning of a pattern, and then we can choose if we want the end of it to happen because we're familiar with the pattern. And we can put these patterns to the test to determine how real they are. And this is where we get to Jordan Peterson's definition of true. If you act as if a certain pattern is real and it reliably leads you to the outcome you wanted, then that pattern is true. This actually fits church doctrine. D&C 9324 said the definition of truth is knowledge of things as they are, as they were, and as they are to come. When I first heard of that, it was when I was thinking of truth as like these, like disembodied facts about the universe that had no like trace of subjectivity whatsoever. But it's actually, truth is knowledge. There is no truth without an intelligent person who has it. And it is something that spans time. So, with that, we can understand light. The best definition, the short definition that I could come up with is light is the transmission or application of truth. And I think light is a perfect term for this concept because it complements physical light and completes your understanding of how to act. Physical light alone illuminates your surroundings, but you still don't know what you should do or how to act unless the physical light has the right abstractions in your mind to channel through. In other words, spiritual light, by giving you truth, gives meaning to physical light. And when you share truth with a person, when you are a light, you judge them because you're telling them something that applies to them. You're telling them how their circumstances are a result of past behavior, and you're also simultaneously offering them salvation because you tell them how different behavior can lead to different circumstances in the future. And you can't have one without the other. If you, here's an example, like if there's somebody you know who is a heavy smoker, but maybe for some reason they've never heard of the science on how bad smoking is for health. If you were to share that with them, you can't help but it coming across as a judgment of their behavior because they're not acting in a smart way. But if you don't share it, they have no way of improving or having better health or improving their circumstances. And so according to Peterson, this is why Christ is both the judge and the savior, psychologically.
And that you could make qualitative distinctions, and there really was a difference between good things and bad things, or great things and evil things. It gives you direction. It gives you the possibility of moving upward. And Ratzinger is pointing out, at least to some degree, that human beings are insufficient in and of themselves and need the movement upward. And so they need to conceptualize something like the highest good, and then to strive for that. And the thing is that there isn't any difference between conceptualizing the good and being judged. Because if you're going to conceptualize the good and move towards it, what you have to do is separate from yourself all those things that aren't good and leave them behind. And that's why the Redeemer and the Judge are the same thing. And one of the things that's really appalling, I think, about our modern world is that we're rejecting the notion of qualitative distinctions. You say, well, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying that one thing is better than another. It's like, okay, fair enough. It's not fun to be cast off with the damned, that's for sure. But if people are in fact insufficient in their present condition, which seems to be the case, I mean, try finding someone who isn't, then if you deny the possibility of qualitative distinction because you want to promote a radical egalitarianism, then you remove the possibility of redemption because there's no movement towards the good. And it seems to me that it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for, well, it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for the equal. Because for us to be equal would mean, as far as I can tell, that we would all be equally unredeemed and miserable. And so,
yeah. So, every slide. All right, so the take-home message from this is the truth is really valuable, and it can come from all sources. It's just whenever you find something that is reliable, consistent, repeatable, and it fits your experience and it's helpful, there's a very high chance that it's true. And we should be open to learning truth from all sources. Joseph Smith said that one of the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism is to receive truth, let it come from whence it may. I think what we can do as people who enjoy learning truth is not to be afraid of sharing it either, because being afraid of judging somebody and having that prevent you from sharing something that could help people is not, like, it's literally darkness. It's and there's a lot of darkness in the world today, not just meaning like sadness or from that sense, but like literally truth is being blocked all over the place because of sensitivity. People haven't really learned the right way to share truth in a way that sensitive people can so it can be palatable to them. There needs to be a lot more of that, but there also just needs to be no shame in sharing something that is actually really good. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I guess I should ask for questions.
A question.
Yeah.
Could you explain what you meant by the D&C 93:11 verse fitting the definition of the kind of pragmatic truth? Because how I understood was it's like talking about things as they were and are and are and will be. Like that kind of sounds like a thing in itself rather than like a pragmatic truth.
Yeah. And this is like a very difficult concept that I've only recently started to grasp, and so I hope I can kind of explain it. This is something that I feel like Jordan Peterson struggles to explain too, or at least in a way that's convincing to a lot of people. If you like look at a map, and life is like a map. That's why his book is called Maps of Meaning. You're trying to figure out how to get somewhere, and however you choose to represent that path is actually kind of unimportant. So how it really is, who's to say exactly how it is? Like the subjective experience of different people can differ a lot, but you can't force your will onto the world around you. You still have to adapt to it. But whatever concept you have of the world that actually allows you to work through it and travel the correct path, that thing could be said to be true. And so if you draw that out and do that an infinite number of times, then that thing is true, definitely true. And it's kind of hard for us to know ultimate truths through just personal experience, but we can like if you turn on a light switch, the first time, maybe like when light bulbs were first invented, someone may not have very much confidence in that, but then confidence increases the more they interact with it, until it's like conceptually it's almost like you're touching the light, you're like interacting with the light directly, like the switch isn't there. Like that's kind of how I think of it. Does anyone have a better explanation than that, or?
I just have another question.
Okay.
So if we embrace this as if it's true, is that conceding that people have their own truths, that there's different truths? Like if truth should inherently be a fact, in the universe, embracing Jordan Peterson's concept of truth, is that validating that there are different truths?
Sort of, because when people say that people have their own truths, they can mean one of two things. And the first thing that people think that the meaning is that you can have your own opinion about what's good and what's bad, and nobody else can tell you it's wrong. It's sort of like moral relativism. But that is like a logically inconsistent opinion to have, because I could just say, well, in my opinion, that's wrong. It's internally inconsistent. It's like anti-logic. Like it has no foundation. But when Jordan Peterson says your truth, what he means is the portion of the truth that you have discovered. And so there are real things, and there's a quote in his book that's really good about this. He's not saying that objects don't exist in the world, because things in the universe run their course, they have their own rationale, they follow laws, and no matter what you want, you can't say this is how things are, because there is a way that things are. But it's very hard for us to learn those truths, and I see it kind of like in math they have a thing called Taylor polynomials, where there's like this really complicated graph, and you don't know the exact equation for it, but the more you approximate it, the more your own line gets closer to it. It'll be off like on the edges, but the more so as you're living life and you're experiencing things, you'll get like there's the truth, like it's actually out there. Like Jennifer Aniston, she's a real person, and maybe your neuron connections are not perfect. You don't really know who she is or what she looks like, but in some situations, but you have a partial view of it, and it gets better over time, and something that you're very confident in, like if you're an honest person, it's got to be true, and so you have a portion of the truth, and it may only fit within your experience, but it is true for that experience. And I don't know a single member of the church who has told me that they've seen God face to face. All of us have different conceptions of what God is. Like on the important stuff, members of the church all agree. Like, yeah, someday, we're His creations. We're gonna grow up to be like Him. But to know God perfectly, we can't do that. We can't comprehend God perfectly. There are many truths that we need first. So there is a truth about God that all members of the church agree on, but there are less important truths that we don't agree on. So even about that, we don't all have perfect approximations to the truth about God. It only fits within the experience that's relevant to us. So I don't know if that.
I think that was a great response. I guess the majority of my bone to pick is with dogmatic phrases, like I know without a shadow of a doubt, And I think it's important to just approach this topic in a similar manner, where it's like you can assume this is true, but I also think it's important to say this is true to your experience. I think it's a way that we can honor and value everyone's individual truth as well as the greater whole.
Yeah.
Just to avoid generalizations.
Yeah, and I've seen sometimes the way people interpret the scriptures too. It's great to liken things unto yourself, but sometimes there are very specific things that happen to characters, and God gives them promises that are to them and probably not to you.
Right.
So I think we need to keep in mind that people's experiences differ as well. So yeah.
Cool. So that's